Keeping current on the latest Harley Davidson products requires all service department personnel to use the information available through a variety of Harley Davidson Company resources. Changes to the servicing procedures for the 2014 Touring and Trike families are the topic for this PhD program. This program will cover the procedures for scheduled service procedures for the steering head bearings, front forks, and cooling system on the 2014 models. This program will demonstrate the basic principles, but you need the service manual to provide you with the specific details on the procedures and specification for the model and year you are servicing. The maintenance requirements for all 2014 Touring and Tri-Glide models now include an entirely new procedure for lubricating and adjusting the steering head bearings. The 2014 models will require that the steering head bearing be lubricated and adjusted at 25,000 mile or 40,000 kilometer intervals. To perform this service, the fairing will need to be removed and the steering head assembly partially disassembled to allow the bearings to be lubricated. To perform this service, you will need to have full access to the front of the motorcycle. To allow for this access, we will demonstrate this service procedure using a floor lift rather than a table-style service lift. We will begin by positioning and securing the motorcycle to the lift according to the instructions for the lift being used. Removing the fairing will require disconnecting many electrical circuits. Because of this, we will begin by removing the saddlebag and side cover so we can remove the maxi fuse. The first components to be removed are the right and left side auxiliary light brackets. They are attached with two cap nuts and the electrical connector is concealed under the bracket. Next, you will need to loosen the three windshield fasteners and then lift out the windshield. The 2014 models use a new windshield which has a different spacing between the mounting points due to the fairing vent. There are only 4 fasteners to remove on the inner side of the fairing. 2 are located near the speaker grills and 2 are located on the lower section of the fairing. All fasteners require a T27 Torx bit for removal. With the rear fasteners removed, the 3 front fasteners and the trim strip on this model can now be removed. Note that these fasteners have different lengths. The center bolt for the windshield is longer than the outer bolts. On the back side, the 2 upper bolts are longer than the 2 lower bolts. With the fasteners removed and the front fender protected, pull out the top edge of the outer fairing and then lift up to free the fairing. Then unplug the headlamp harness to remove the outer shell. The procedure for removing the inner dash will be different on a CVO Limited from the other fairing models. We'll demonstrate the CVO first. On the CVO Limited, the fuel tank will need to be moved back for clearance. This will require that the seat be removed. Before removing the fuel line, the pressure must be released. Begin by disconnecting the gray fuel pump connector under the seat. With the pump disconnected, install the maxi fuse and turn over or start the engine. Let the engine stall to ensure that the fuel pressure has been bled down, and then remove the maxi fuse. With the pressure released, the fuel line can be disconnected from the fuel tank. Remove the 4 fuel tank mounting bolts, and then protect the tank as you lift and slide the tank back 3 to 4 inches or 75 to 100 millimeters. The dash is retained by 1 screw on each side. Use a 5/32 hex bit to remove them. With the screws removed, slide the dash back until you can access the electrical connectors under the cover. Release the locks and unplug the connectors to remove the dash. Now we will demonstrate the removal procedure on models that have the standard ignition switch. These models require that the switch knob be removed rather than sliding the fuel tank back. To remove the switch knob, insert the key and turn it to the unlock position and leave the key installed. Then rotate the knob to the fork lock position. Reach under the left side of the knob and press in and hold the release button under the knob. Now turn the key an additional 60 degrees counterclockwise. You can then lift the knob to remove it. Note the position of the spring that will drop out of the bore on the underside of the knob when removed. With the 2 side screws removed and the fuel tank covered, turn the handlebar slightly and slide the cover out. This will allow you to reach in and disconnect the two connectors. Use care to prevent cosmetic damage. All models will have the two harness connectors. If no switches are used, the cover will have a switch hole plug for retaining and sealing the connector. With the knob removed, you will need to use the new Ignition Switch Alignment tool to move the switch to other positions as required. Insert the tool until the bottom of the handle contacts the top of the ignition switch. Rotate the handle to the selected position. With the dash removed, we continue with the procedure by disconnecting all of the electrical connectors between the fairing and the chassis. Refer to the diagram in the service manual to determine which connectors will need to be unplugged and which anchor points must be released. To prevent damage to the wiring, use the appendix for guidance in how to release the connector locks if you are not familiar with them. With the harness connectors separated, remove the two lower double studs so that the lower skirt can be removed. Loosen and remove the top two double studs. Next, lift the fairing assembly up about 1 to 2 inches or 25 to 50 millimeters until the side brackets clear the lower bosses. The fairing may also contact the handlebar or switch housing, so do not use excessive force. Now tilt the top of the fairing forward until the brackets clear the handlebar, and then lift the assembly up and off the motorcycle. Rest the fairing on the bench, taking precautions to provide protection for the inner fairing to prevent cosmetic damage. The fairing is removed as an assembly to perform repairs such as handlebar replacement, fork bracket repair, and steering head bearing lubrication or replacement. Bearing service continues with the removal of the upper fork bracket. Start by disconnecting the connector for the ignition switch and any remaining connectors between the handlebar and the main wiring harness. Loosen the two fork pinch screws on the back of the bracket and the single upper steering stem screw in the front. Lift up to remove the upper fork bracket and handlebar as an assembly. Carefully lay the assembly on the protected fuel tank and secure with elastic cords. Raise the motorcycle until the front tire is just touching the floor and the forks are fully extended. The upper fork bracket is the fork stop. With the bracket removed, you will need to place a wooden block between the forks and frame to secure the forks and avoid damage when loosening or tightening the upper steering stem nut. With the block in place, remove the upper steering stem. Raise the motorcycle until the lower stem bearing is exposed under the frame head far enough to clean the grease from the bearing cup. This will also allow access to the rollers of the bearing cone. The front wheel will need to be blocked to prevent movement. Wipe the existing grease from the upper and lower bearing cups and cones, using only a clean, lint-free cloth or wipe. Do not use any solvents. With the parts cleaned, inspect the races and rollers for wear or scoring to determine if replacement is needed. If bearing replacement is needed, internal reliefs in the steering head will provide you with access so you can use a long drift punch to drive the bearing cups out of the frame. To install new bearing cups, you will use the components from the wheel bearing installer. Use the -3 installer plate on the bearing cup and the -4 plate in the frame head. Tighten the tool until both cups are seated in bore. Using your finger, pack the lower bearing with special purpose grease. Also apply grease to the bearing race. With the lower bearing lubricated, slowly lower the motorcycle until the lower bearing is seated just enough to take out any play in the bearing. Do not place the weight of the vehicle on the bearing. Using your finger, apply special purpose grease to the cone and race of the upper bearing. Then apply a small amount to the threads of the upper steering stem. Now thread the upper steering stem into the lower stem and hand tighten. With the wooden block in place to prevent damage, tighten the upper stem to 35 foot-pounds or 47.5 Newton meters. Now lower the vehicle until the forks begin to compress. Loosen upper steering stem 90 to 100 degrees. Tighten to specification. Proper torque for fairing models is 60 to 65 inch-pounds or 6.8 to 7.3 Newton meters. For Road King models, it's 110 to 115 inch-pounds or 12.4 to 13.0 Newton meters. For trike models, the correct torque is 110 to 115 inch-pounds or 12.4 to 13.0 Newton meters. Before we continue with the assembly and adjustment procedures, we will discuss front fork service procedures. The maintenance schedule lists that the forks require disassembly, inspection, and replacement of fork oil every 50,000 miles or 80,000 kilometers. The forks must be removed to replace the fork oil. To remove the forks, loosen the pinch bolts on both the upper and lower brackets and slide the forks out. Clamp the fork slider in a vise using soft jaws. Loosen, but do not remove the lower screw. You'll need a 12 millimeter long hex bit to reach the bolt on most models. Next, mount the tube in the holding fixture and remove the top plug with a 3/4 inch hex bit. With the fork spring and spacer removed, drain the fork. Following the manual, disassemble and inspect the forks and replace components as required. The left leg of the CVO Road King uses a cartridge-style fork and is identified by a black upper fork plug. Refer to the service manual for service procedures on this model. With the fork reassembled after inspection, the oil level can be set. With the fork vertical and the spring, spacer, and sleeve removed, add slightly more than 24 ounces or 710 cc's of Type E fork oil, and pump the fork until resistance is felt. Set the fork oil gauge to 3.84 inches or 95 millimeters. With the fork fully compressed, use the tool to remove excess fluid to establish the correct oil level. Install the spring, spacer, and sleeve to the fork, and install the top plug, tightening it to the proper torque. The service forks are then installed in the lower fork bracket and positioned to the specified height from the top rear of the lower fork bracket. The two pinch bolts are then tightened to specification and the wheel and fender can be installed. Now that the forks are in place, the handlebar and upper bracket can be reinstalled. Verify that the bracket is seated by observing that there is no gap around the dust shield on the stem. The tapered band on the top of the fork tube should be approximately half exposed when viewed from the rear of the bracket. Using the service manual, verify the position of all of the cables and wiring harness elements. Then tighten the pinch bolts for the fork tubes to specification. Before the bearing can be adjusted, the fairing must be reinstalled. With the fairing tilted forward, slide the lower fairing brackets over the upper mounting bosses on the fork bracket. The boss must be inside the channel formed by the support brackets. As you continue to slide the fairing into position, you will need to rotate the fairing. Use care to avoid damaging the finish on the inner fairing and fuel tank, and pinching the auxiliary lamp harness as you move the fairing into position. As the rotation continues, the ends of the fairing brackets must capture the boss on the lower fork bracket. When positioned correctly, the boss will be inside the channel formed by the support bracket. With the fairing in place, install the upper double studs, followed by the fairing skirt and the two lower studs. When all four are in place, they can be tightened to specification. The dash can now be installed. Connect the two harness connectors to the switches or to the cover posts, and install the cover with the two side screws. Using the diagram in the service manual as reference, plug in the wiring harness connectors and anchor the ties to the various components on the radio chassis and supports. On Tri-Glide models, fully install and tighten the following components. On two-wheeled models, the outer fairing and remaining components will be temporarily installed as part of the bearing adjustment procedure. Begin by checking the fairing seal and installing the outer fairing. Start but do not fully tighten the four inner fairing screws. The longer screws are on the top, with the shorter screws on the bottom. Install the windshield, position the trim strip, and loosely thread in the three screws. Temporarily attach the auxiliary lamp brackets with the two cap nuts. On the CVO model, the fuel tank and seat can be fully reassembled at this time. The motorcycle is now ready for the final adjustment of the steering head bearings using the new swing-back procedure. This procedure is not required on the Tri-Glide models. On the Road King models, you will need to disconnect the clutch cable from the hand control at this time. The bike must be raised so that both of the tires are off the ground. A wood block can be installed under the rear tire to provide stability during the adjustment. The bike must also be level, front to back and side to side. This can be checked by using a small level on the lower frame rail. Swing the forks from side to side to check for smooth and unobstructed movement. Also grab the forks near the axle and check that there is no free play or clunking present. Attach a piece of cardboard across the fender tip and position a pointer in the center with the wheel pointing straight forward. Do not move the pointer at any time during this procedure. Starting with the wheel resting in its natural centered position, gently tap on the tire to move the wheel to the side. Keep moving the wheel until you find the spot at which the wheel begins to swing back to the center on its own. Repeat this several times and mark the average spot that this occurs on the cardboard. Now repeat the procedure in the opposite direction. Tap on the tire, moving the wheel off-center until it swings back, and mark this point on the card. Using a different color marker, measure out 1 inch or 25 millimeters from each mark and place a line on the cardboard at this point. Now turn the wheel to the side until the pointer aligns with the outer mark, and then release the wheel. Note the point at which the wheel stops. Repeat this several times and, using a different colored marker, mark this point on the cardboard. Repeat this test using the outer mark on the other side. To determine the bearing adjustment, measure the distance between the two marks made during the last 2 steps. Compare your measurement to the specification in the service manual. There are 2 specifications, one for fairing models and one for Road King models. If your measurement is less than the specification, the bearings are too loose and will need to be tightened. If your measurement is larger than the specification, the bearings are too tight and they will need to be adjusted. To adjust the bearings, insert a 1/4 inch extension through the lower steering stem into a socket in the upper steering stem. This will allow the tension on the bearings to be adjusted. Rotating the extension to the right, or clockwise, will loosen the bearing adjustment. Turning the extension to the left, or counterclockwise, will tighten the bearing adjustment. Remove the auxiliary lamp brackets and the outer fairing. With the outer fairing removed, you can use a short 5/16 ball end hex bit to loosen the single upper steering stem screw in the front. Based on our measurement, our motorcycle's bearings are too loose, so we will need to install the extension and turn the upper stem to the left, or counterclockwise, to increase the preload on the bearings. With the fender protected, the extension is installed and engaged with the upper stem. We now rotate the extension left, or counterclockwise, to increase the preload. Change the tension in small increments only, until you develop a feel with practice, to gauge how the adjustment will be affected. After adjusting the bearings, you will need to retest the swingback as we demonstrated earlier. When the measurement falls within the specified range, final assembly can be done. Remove the auxiliary lamp brackets and the outer fairing. With the outer fairing removed, you can use a short 5/16 ball end hex bit to tighten the pinch bolt to specification. This is critical as the clamp load from this pinch bolt keeps the upper stem from rotating and changing the bearing adjustment. With the pinch bolt properly tightened, the outer fairing and lighting brackets can be installed and tightened to specifications to complete the service procedure. The bearing adjustment can be checked at any time without disassembling the fairing, using the swing back measurement procedure. On Road King models, the clutch cable must be disconnected for accurate measurements. Trikes, the Limited, and the CVO Limited models use the twin cooling system. This system reduces the cylinder head temperatures around the exhaust valves and allows the engine to run higher compression ratios and produce more power without experiencing detonation due to heat buildup in the combustion chamber. The system uses an electric water pump that is mounted under the voltage regulator at the front of the engine. On the right side of the assembly, a thermostat is mounted. This controls the flow of coolant through the system. 2 lines run up between the frame down tubes to connect the system to the cylinder heads. The coolant lines from the pump connect to manifold assemblies above the induction module and then to the front and rear cylinder heads. Passages in the cylinder heads direct the coolant around the exhaust valve seat and back out the cylinder head to the line back to the thermostat. When the coolant temperature is below 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 75 degrees centigrade, the coolant is returned back to the engine. As the temperature rises above this level, the thermostat begins to open and the coolant flows out to the left side radiator, and then up and over to the right side radiator before returning to the thermostat unit and pump. A cooling fan is mounted behind each radiator and receives electrical power from a relay in the fuse block. The ECM receives temperature signals from the coolant temperature sensor at the bottom of the left radiator. The ECM will activate the relay and connect the fans to ground based on the coolant temperature. The fans may run when the bike is turned off if the ECM detects a need based on temperature. The ECM will also generate DTCs for the fan circuit if problems occur. The surface of the radiator should be cleaned at every scheduled service. To access the surface of the radiator, carefully pry on the curved surface of the outer edge of the cover panel to release the latches. Use a soft brush or fin cleaning tool to remove debris from the surface. To test or replace the coolant, use a coin to pry out the top and sides of the cover on the right lower to access the coolant tank and cap. When the coolant is at an ambient temperature, the level in the tank should align with the line cast into the tank. The coolant can be checked with the bike on the jiffy stand or upright by using the corresponding line on the tank. If the coolant is low, inspect for leaks and add coolant as needed. To test the coolant's protection level, remove the radiator cap and use the coolant test tool to check the freezing point for the coolant. If the freezing protection does not meet specifications, it should be replaced. The coolant should also be drained and replaced every 30,000 miles or 46,000 kilometers. To drain the coolant, pull out on the rear of the plastic pump cover, then rotate and remove the cover from the mount. With the filler cap installed and coolant bottle cap removed, release the spring clamp on the outlet line at the water pump and pull the line off the pump. Do not use excessive force or pry on the line as the pump fitting may break. Let the system drain until the coolant bottle is empty and dispose of coolant appropriately. Connect the line at the pump and make sure the hose clamp is installed between the raised barb and pump body. Do not install the clamp directly over the raised area. Pull the filler neck out from the fairing lower and remove the pressure cap. Using a squeeze bottle filled with Harley Davidson coolant, slowly fill the system through the filler neck until coolant is visible. Allow the coolant to bleed down and repeat until the level stabilizes. Next, you will need to bleed the air from the cooling system. Turn the ignition switch and the handlebar switch on, but do not start the engine. Open the throttle to more than 50% and hold for at least 3 seconds. The coolant pump and fans will start. Then release the throttle. As the pump runs, continue to add coolant until the level in the filler neck remains steady. Turn the ignition switch off to stop the pump and fans. Install the pressure cap and verify that the tab on the cap contacts the stop for proper system operation. Secure the filler neck to the retainer on the coolant bottle. Finally, fill the coolant bottle to the cold fill line and install the cover plate. Then start the engine and run the engine until it warms up and check for leaks. The 2014 model touring bikes introduce many new features, along with improved technology, to enhance the Harley-Davidson owner's riding experience. The procedures shown in this program are subject to change. Always refer to the service manuals for the model and year you are servicing, and current service bulletins for specific procedures and specifications, to provide your customers with an exceptional riding experience.